When Sarah Henderson's DNA case was officially closed in 2024, nobody knew that 61 years earlier, another murder had been committed by the same family. Margaret Henderson had killed a man in 1963 and buried his body in the backyard of the old house she intended to leave as inheritance to her granddaughter. 2 generations, 2 murders, same Millbrook soil. But this time the killer wasn't the victim, it was the victim's grandmother. The discovery came 3 months after Thomas Carlyle's identification as Sarah's killer, when the Henderson family finally felt ready to deal with Margaret's estate. The old farmhouse on County Road 47 had sat empty since Margaret's death in 2019, its rooms filled with the accumulated possessions of a woman who had lived 85 years carrying secrets that would have destroyed her family's understanding of who they were and where they came from. Michael Henderson had been dreading this moment for 5 years. At 58, he was Margaret's only surviving grandchild, the reluctant inheritor of a property that held too many memories and required too much maintenance for a man approaching retirement. His plan was simple: clean out the house, sell the furniture that had value, donate what could be donated, and put the property on the market before winter made rural Illinois real estate even harder to move. If you're following cases where family secrets span generations and the line between victim and perpetrator becomes impossibly blurred, make sure you're subscribed, because what Michael Henderson discovered in his grandmother's bedroom would reveal that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones carrying the darkest truths. The house had been built in 1947 by Margaret's husband Robert Henderson, constructed with the solid craftsmanship that characterized post-war construction when men returned from overseas with skills learned in military engineering and a determination to build something permanent. The 2-story farmhouse featured thick plaster walls, hardwood floors, and the kind of attention to detail that modern construction rarely achieved, including hidden storage spaces and built-in compartments that Robert had installed for practical purposes but which would later serve his wife's more sinister needs. Michael's first week of cleaning had been manageable, focusing on the obvious items that needed removal or disposal. Kitchen appliances from the 1980s, clothing that would go to charity, books and magazines that reflected Margaret's interests in gardening, cooking, and local history. The process was emotionally difficult but not surprising. Every family faces this moment when a generation passes and their accumulated possessions become someone else's burden to sort through. The bedroom had been saved for last because Michael knew it would be the most challenging room to face. This was where Margaret had spent her final years after mobility issues made climbing stairs impossible, where she had died peacefully in her sleep surrounded by the photographs and mementos that connected her to 8 decades of life in rural Illinois. The room still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets she had kept in her dresser drawers and the medicinal creams that had provided relief from arthritis pain during her final months. Margaret's dresser was a massive piece of furniture that had belonged to her own mother, constructed from solid oak sometime in the early 1900s and built to last through generations of family use. The drawers were deep and numerous, designed for an era when people owned fewer clothes but kept them longer, when storage space was precious and furniture was expected to serve multiple purposes throughout a family's lifetime. The hidden compartment wasn't immediately obvious, concealed behind what appeared to be a decorative panel on the dresser's side. Michael discovered it accidentally when he bumped against the furniture while moving Margaret's jewelry box, causing a section of the wooden panel to shift slightly and reveal a narrow opening that had been invisible when the panel was properly aligned. Inside the compartment, wrapped in oiled cloth that had preserved them from moisture and decay for over 6 decades, were 3 items that would transform Michael's understanding of his family history and launch an investigation into a murder that had remained hidden since the Kennedy administration. The first item was a bundle of newspaper clippings from 1963, all dealing with the disappearance of Frank Morrison, a 34-year-old farm equipment salesman who had vanished while making sales calls in rural McLean County. The headlines told a familiar story of a missing person case that had generated initial concern but gradually faded from public attention as leads dried up and other news captured the community's focus. Local salesman missing after route calls, read one clipping from September 1963. Search continues for missing father of 3, reported another from October. By December, the coverage had dwindled to brief mentions in the police blotter, and by the following spring, Frank Morrison had become another unsolved disappearance in a rural county that lacked the resources to pursue complex investigations indefinitely. The second item was far more disturbing: a leather-bound journal filled with Margaret Henderson's careful handwriting, documenting thoughts and events from 1963 with the kind of methodical precision that characterized her approach to everything from household budgets to garden planning. The entries began innocuously enough, discussing weather, farm work, and social activities in the understated style that defined rural Midwestern communication during that era. But as Michael read deeper into the journal, the entries became increasingly agitated and fearful, describing unwanted visits from Frank Morrison that had begun as legitimate business calls but gradually evolved into something more threatening and personal. Margaret's handwriting, normally neat and controlled, became shakier and more urgent as she described Morrison's inappropriate comments, his refusal to accept that she wasn't interested in purchasing new equipment, and his insistence on returning to the farm even when her husband Robert was away on business. The final entry, dated September 15, 1963, was the one that would haunt Michael for the rest of his life. Frank came back again today when Robert was in Springfield. He tried to force himself on me in the kitchen. I shot him with Robert's deer rifle. He's dead. I buried him in the back pasture near the old oak tree. God forgive me, but he was going to rape me and I couldn't let that happen. Robert can never know about this. The third item was the most chilling evidence of Margaret's methodical nature. A hand-drawn map showing the exact location of Frank Morrison's grave, complete with measurements and landmarks that would allow someone to locate the burial site even decades later. The map showed distances from the house, the old oak tree, and the fence line, with careful notations about depth and soil conditions that suggested Margaret had put considerable thought into concealing her crime as thoroughly as possible. Michael sat on Margaret's bed for nearly an hour, reading and rereading the journal entries while trying to process the implications of what he had discovered. The grandmother who had baked him cookies, taught him to play cards, and provided the kind of unconditional love that grandparents specialize in had committed murder and hidden the evidence for over 60 years. Every family gathering, every holiday celebration, every moment of shared warmth had occurred while Margaret carried this secret, performing the role of loving grandmother while knowing she had taken a man's life and deprived his children of their father. The psychological impact of this revelation was compounded by the recent resolution of Sarah's case, which had already forced Michael to confront the reality that his family had been touched by violence in ways he had never imagined. Learning that Sarah had been murdered by Thomas Carlyle had been devastating enough, but at least Carlyle was a stranger whose evil had invaded their family from outside. Margaret's crime was different. It suggested that violence and deception might be inherent characteristics of the Henderson family line rather than external forces that had victimized them. Michael's first instinct was to destroy the evidence and protect Margaret's memory, to spare his family the additional trauma of learning that their beloved matriarch had been capable of killing another human being. The journal and map could be burned, the hidden compartment could remain secret, and Frank Morrison's disappearance could stay unsolved for another 60 years. Margaret was dead, beyond the reach of earthly justice, and revealing her crime would serve no purpose except to cause pain to people who had already suffered enough loss. But as Michael considered this option, he began thinking about Frank Morrison's family, about children who had spent 61 years wondering what had happened to their father, about grandchildren who had never met the grandfather whose disappearance had shaped their family's history. The same empathy that had made Sarah's murder so devastating was now demanding that Michael consider the Morrison family's right to know the truth, regardless of how that truth might affect the Henderson family's reputation and emotional well-being. The decision to contact authorities wasn't made immediately but evolved over several days as Michael wrestled with competing loyalties and moral obligations. He researched Frank Morrison's family, learning that 2 of Frank's 3 children were still alive, now in their late 60s, and had grandchildren of their own who had grown up with stories about the grandfather who had simply vanished one day in 1963. The Morrison family had never stopped wondering what had happened to Frank, had never achieved the closure that comes with knowing how and why a loved one died. Detective Jennifer Walsh of the Illinois State Police had been expecting Michael Henderson's call ever since she learned about Margaret Henderson's connection to the Sarah Henderson case. Walsh had spent 15 years working cold cases and had developed an instinct for sensing when one solved case might lead to another. The Henderson family's long residence in McLean County, combined with Margaret's advanced age and the suspicious circumstances of Sarah's murder, had suggested to Walsh that other secrets might be hidden in the family's history. When Michael finally called the Illinois State Police Cold Case Unit on a gray November morning in 2024, Walsh listened to his story with the professional composure that came from years of hearing confessions and revelations that challenged conventional understanding of crime and family dynamics. She arranged to meet Michael at the Henderson farmhouse the following day, bringing with her a team of forensic specialists who could determine whether Margaret's journal and map would lead to the recovery of Frank Morrison's remains. The excavation began on November 15, 2024, exactly 61 years and 2 months after Frank Morrison's murder. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed the presence of human remains at the location indicated by Margaret's map, buried approximately 4 feet deep near the old oak tree that still stood at the edge of what had once been pasture land but was now overgrown with brush and volunteer trees that had grown up during the decades since the Henderson family stopped farming. The forensic team worked with archaeological precision, carefully removing layers of soil and documenting the position of bones and artifacts that had been preserved by Illinois clay soil and protected from surface disturbance by Margaret's careful selection of the burial site. Frank Morrison's skeleton was largely intact, along with remnants of his clothing, his wallet containing identification and family photographs, and the bullet that had ended his life, still lodged in his ribcage where it had remained since September 1963. The forensic pathologist's examination confirmed Margaret's account of the shooting, revealing that Frank had been killed by a single rifle bullet fired from close range into his chest. The trajectory and wound characteristics were consistent with defensive shooting rather than execution-style killing, supporting Margaret's claim that she had acted to protect herself from sexual assault. The bullet's caliber matched the hunting rifle that Robert Henderson had owned, according to family records Michael provided to investigators. DNA analysis of the remains confirmed the identity as Frank Morrison through comparison with samples provided by his surviving children, who had waited 61 years to learn what had happened to their father. The scientific confirmation of Frank's death provided closure for the Morrison family while creating complex emotions for everyone involved in the case. Relief that the mystery was finally solved, sadness for the decades of uncertainty the family had endured, and strange sympathy for Margaret Henderson, whose crime had apparently been committed in self-defense but whose decision to hide the evidence had prolonged the Morrison family's suffering for over 6 decades. The legal implications of Margaret's crime were complicated by the passage of time and her death 5 years earlier. Illinois had no statute of limitations for murder, but prosecuting a dead person was obviously impossible, leaving law enforcement officials to close Frank Morrison's case as solved but without the possibility of bringing criminal charges. The case would be classified as justified homicide in self-defense, based on Margaret's journal account and the physical evidence recovered from the burial site. Michael Henderson's decision to reveal his grandmother's secret had solved a 61-year-old murder case, but it had also created new questions about family identity, moral responsibility, and the long-term consequences of keeping secrets. The Henderson family now faced the reality that both generations had been touched by violent death. Sarah as a victim of external evil, Margaret as someone who had committed justifiable homicide but had chosen to hide her actions rather than trust the legal system to recognize her right to self-defense. The Morrison family's reaction to learning the truth about Frank's death was complex, mixing relief with anger that Margaret had allowed them to suffer decades of uncertainty rather than revealing what had happened. Frank's eldest son, Robert Morrison, now 71 years old, expressed gratitude for finally knowing his father's fate while questioning why Margaret had chosen secrecy over honesty when the evidence suggested she had acted in legitimate self-defense. "My father wasn't perfect," Robert Morrison told reporters after Frank's remains were identified. "If he was trying to assault Mrs. Henderson, then she had every right to protect herself. What I can't understand is why she let us spend 61 years wondering if he was alive somewhere, if he had abandoned us, if he was buried in some unmarked grave where we'd never find him. She could have called the police and explained what happened. Instead, she buried our father like he was a criminal and let us live with questions that didn't need to exist." The psychological profile that emerged from Margaret's journal revealed a woman who had been shaped by the social expectations and legal realities of rural Illinois in the early 1960s, when women's rights to self-defense were less clearly established and when the shame associated with sexual assault often prevented victims from seeking help through official channels. Margaret's decision to hide Frank's death reflected not just personal fear but also the cultural context of an era when women who reported assault were often blamed for inviting male attention. Dr. Patricia Chin, a forensic psychologist who reviewed Margaret's journal for the investigation, noted that Margaret's behavior was consistent with trauma responses common among women of her generation who experienced sexual violence. Mrs. Henderson was dealing with a situation that would have been difficult for any woman in 1963, but especially challenging for someone living in a small rural community where gossip and judgment could destroy reputations and relationships, Dr. Chin explained. Her decision to keep the shooting secret wasn't necessarily about guilt over killing Frank Morrison. It was likely about shame over being targeted for assault and fear that she wouldn't be believed or supported. The journal entries that followed the murder revealed Margaret's struggle to live with her secret while maintaining the appearance of normal family life. She wrote extensively about nightmares, anxiety attacks, and the constant fear that Frank's body would be discovered or that someone would connect her to his disappearance. The psychological toll of keeping such a significant secret had clearly affected Margaret's mental health, though she had managed to function normally enough that her family never suspected the trauma she was carrying. Margaret's relationship with her husband Robert had been complicated by her inability to share what had happened, creating a distance between them that she blamed on other factors in her journal entries. She wrote about feeling lonely even when surrounded by family, about the burden of performing normalcy while carrying knowledge that isolated her from everyone she loved. The entries suggested that Margaret had considered confessing to Robert multiple times over the years but had always decided against it, fearing that the truth would destroy their marriage and expose her to legal consequences. The impact on the Henderson family's understanding of their own history was profound and lasting. Michael's daughter Jennifer, now 32 and a mother of 2 young children, struggled to reconcile her memories of the loving great-grandmother who had been a central figure in her childhood with the knowledge that Margaret had killed a man and hidden his body for over 6 decades. The family gatherings that had been sources of warmth and connection now felt complicated by the presence of this enormous secret that had shaped every interaction without anyone knowing it existed. The broader community of Millbrook and McLean County faced similar challenges in processing the revelation that Margaret Henderson, a respected member of their community for over 80 years, had been carrying such a significant secret. Margaret had been active in church activities, volunteer organizations, and community events, building relationships and contributing to civic life while knowing that she had committed homicide and concealed evidence of a crime. The discovery forced longtime residents to question how well they really knew their neighbors and what other secrets might be hidden behind familiar facades. The investigation also raised questions about the effectiveness of missing person investigations in rural areas during the 1960s, when communication between law enforcement agencies was limited and forensic technology was primitive compared to modern standards. Frank Morrison's disappearance had been investigated by local authorities who lacked the resources and expertise to pursue complex cases involving potential foul play. The assumption that Frank had simply left his family voluntarily had prevented investigators from conducting the thorough search that might have led to the discovery of his grave site. Detective Walsh's final report on the case highlighted how social attitudes toward women's rights and sexual assault had evolved dramatically since 1963. Noting that Margaret Henderson might have faced very different legal consequences if her crime had occurred in the modern era. Current Illinois law provided stronger protections for victims of sexual assault who used deadly force in self-defense, and modern investigative techniques would have been more likely to corroborate Margaret's account of events and support her claim that the shooting was justified. The forensic evidence supported Margaret's version of events in multiple ways that wouldn't have been available to investigators in 1963. The trajectory of the bullet wound was consistent with defensive shooting by someone of Margaret's height and physical build. The absence of defensive wounds on Frank's hands suggested that he had been surprised by the shooting rather than engaged in a prolonged struggle. Most significantly, the position of Frank's body when it was buried showed no evidence of additional violence or torture that might have indicated malicious intent rather than self-defense. The excavation of Frank Morrison's grave also revealed details about Margaret's state of mind immediately after the shooting that demonstrated both her fear and her practical nature. Frank had been buried fully clothed, with his personal belongings intact, suggesting that Margaret had been focused on concealing evidence of his death rather than robbing him or destroying his identity. The careful selection of the burial site and the detailed map she had created showed that Margaret had expected the grave might eventually be discovered and had wanted to ensure that Frank's remains could be properly identified and returned to his family. The resolution of Frank Morrison's case provided closure for his family while creating new trauma for the Henderson family, who now faced the reality that their beloved matriarch had been capable of taking a human life, even in self-defense. The moral complexity of Margaret's situation, a woman who had killed to protect herself but had chosen to hide evidence that might have exonerated her, challenged conventional understanding of right and wrong and forced everyone involved to grapple with questions about justice, family loyalty, and the long-term consequences of secrecy. The memorial service for Frank Morrison, held 61 years after his death, drew members of both the Morrison and Henderson families, creating an unprecedented gathering of people whose lives had been shaped by events they had never fully understood. Michael Henderson's decision to attend the service and speak about his grandmother's journal demonstrated a commitment to truth and reconciliation that helped both families begin the process of healing from decades of uncertainty and hidden trauma. As the investigation into Margaret Henderson's 61-year-old secret came to a close, it served as a reminder that every family carries stories that span generations, and that the line between victim and perpetrator can be far more complicated than it appears on the surface. The case also demonstrated how advances in forensic science and changes in social attitudes can provide new understanding of historical crimes, offering closure to families who have waited decades for answers while challenging communities to reconsider their assumptions about the people they thought they knew. If you've been following this investigation into how a family's darkest secret remained hidden for over 6 decades, we want to hear your thoughts about Margaret Henderson's decision to conceal Frank Morrison's death rather than report it as self-defense. Do you think she was right to protect herself and her family from the potential consequences of revealing what had happened? Or should she have trusted the legal system to recognize her right to defend herself against assault? Share your theories in the comments below, subscribe to stay updated on cases where family secrets span generations, and hit the notification bell so you never miss when we explore the complex moral questions that arise when the past refuses to stay buried.